On January 18th, 2026, Europe did something it has never done before. It pressed a button it built 3 years ago and swore it would never actually use. It's called the anti-coercion instrument, and right now it's aimed directly at American tech giants, banks, and anyone doing business between Washington and Brussels. This isn't a trade war with China. This isn't tariffs on steel or soybeans. This is NATO allies threatening to economically kneecap each other over a frozen island most people couldn't find on a map. The weapon was designed for economic blackmail, and now, for the first time in history, it's live. So what finally pushed Europe to pull the trigger? Why is Greenland suddenly worth blowing up one of the most important trade relationships on the planet? And what happens when the countries that are supposed to protect each other start acting like enemies? Stick around, because by the end of this video you're going to understand why this moment might reshape the entire global order and why it all started with a piece of ice nobody thought mattered until now. Part 1. The line that wasn't supposed to be crossed. Let's rewind for a second, because to understand why this moment is so insane, you need to know what this weapon actually is and why Europe built it in the first place. In late 2023, the European Union adopted something called the anti-coercion instrument. Think of it like a legal nuke sitting in a glass case with a sign that says, "Break only in case of economic blackmail." It was designed to respond to one very specific thing. When a foreign power uses trade as a weapon to force Europe into doing something it doesn't want to do, not normal tariffs, not a disagreement over car imports or cheese quotas, we're talking about full-blown economic coercion, the kind where someone says, "Do what I want or I'll destroy your economy." Here's the thing though, Europe never actually wanted to use it. They called it a deterrent, a big scary stick you wave around so nobody messes with you. The whole point was that if it existed, nobody would be dumb enough to test it. For almost 3 years, that's exactly what happened. It sat there, unused, untouched. A theoretical weapon in a theoretical war that everyone hoped would stay theoretical forever. Why? Because Europe doesn't like escalating trade conflicts, especially not internally, and especially not with allies. The European Union has always been about cooperation, negotiation, talking things out over wine and paperwork until everyone agrees to disagree politely. Economic warfare between friends, that's not supposed to happen. That's what you do with adversaries. That's what you do when trust is gone. But calling this thing a big bazooka isn't just dramatic language, it matters. Because a bazooka isn't a tool you use every day. It's not a hammer or a wrench. It's a weapon of last resort. You pull it out when everything else has failed and the situation is so bad that doing nothing would be worse than blowing something up. The fact that they designed it this way tells you everything. They built it hoping they'd never need it. So what changed? Greenland. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, wait, Greenland, the giant ice block nobody lives on, then yeah, you're on the right track. But here's where it gets interesting. Greenland isn't just some random frozen rock, it's an autonomous territory of Denmark. That means Denmark is in charge, but Greenland gets to run its own show on a lot of stuff. It's complicated, like most things in geopolitics, but the key point is this. Greenland is European, it's under European protection. It's part of the European sphere, even if it's not technically in the EU, and someone just tried to buy it. Not subtly, not through back channels or diplomatic whispers, publicly, loudly, with threats attached. This isn't about Greenland's fish or Greenland's ice. It's about what Greenland represents: sovereignty. The idea that you can't just bully a country into giving up territory because you want it. The principle that Europe gets to decide what happens in Europe, not someone on the other side of the Atlantic. And when that principle gets challenged, when someone tries to use economic force to override it, that's when the weapons come out. The root cause here isn't trade imbalance. It's not about who owes who what. It's about coercion tied to territorial sovereignty. It's about someone saying, "Give me that land or I'll wreck your economy," and Europe saying, "Absolutely not." But this didn't come out of nowhere. There were warning signs. The Arctic has been heating up, not just literally, but geopolitically. Security tensions have been rising. Alliances have been straining. Everyone's been watching the Arctic like it's the next big chessboard, because it is. Melting ice means new shipping routes, new resources, new strategic positions, and with that comes new conflicts. Europe built a weapon hoping never to need it, and then someone gave them a reason. Part 2. The Greenland Ultimatum. Alright, so here's where things go from tense to absolutely bonkers. On January 17th, 2026, President Donald Trump made an announcement. He's slapping a 10% tariff on all goods coming from 8 European nations. Not just any nations. Specifically, Denmark, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Sweden, Finland, the Netherlands, and Norway. 8 countries, 10% tariff, starting February 1st, 2026. But wait, it gets better. He didn't stop there. Trump said if these countries don't play ball, that 10% is going up to 25%. By June 1st, 2026, 25% on everything. That's not a slap on the wrist. That's economic devastation for exporters in those countries. That's jobs gone, markets collapsed, trade relationships torched. And what does he want in exchange for not doing this? Quote, complete and total purchase of Greenland. Not a negotiation. Not a discussion about Arctic cooperation or shared security interests. A purchase. Like Greenland is a piece of real estate on Zillow. Like you can just buy a territory full of people who have their own government and their own identity because you think it would be cool to own it. Now, under normal circumstances, this would qualify as economic coercion by any definition. You're using tariffs, not as a trade tool, but as leverage to force a geopolitical outcome. That's textbook. That's literally what the anti-coercion instrument was designed to stop. But here's the kicker. This isn't happening in a vacuum. Remember those 8 countries Trump just threatened? They all have something in common. They all just deployed troops to Greenland as part of a NATO-led security exercise called Arctic Endurance. The whole point of the exercise was to bolster Arctic security, to show that NATO can operate in that region, to send a message that the Arctic isn't just open season for whoever wants to grab it. Trump called this playing a very dangerous game. Let that sink in. NATO allies conducting a NATO exercise in a NATO-aligned territory are being accused of playing a dangerous game by another NATO member, and that NATO member is threatening them economically unless they back off and let him buy the place. This is where trade policy stops being about trade and starts being about geopolitics. The tariffs aren't the point. Greenland is the point. The tariffs are just the weapon. They're the stick being used to beat Europe into submission. And Europe is looking at this and thinking, if we let this happen, if we let someone use trade as a cudgel to take our territory, what's next? Where does this stop? So the tariffs aren't just tariffs. They're an ultimatum. And ultimatums have a way of forcing decisions nobody wanted to make. Europe built a bazooka, and now someone just gave them a target. Part 3. Inside Europe's trade bazooka. Okay, so what does this thing actually do? Because anti-coercion instrument sounds fancy, but what does it mean in practice? Let's break it down. First up, tech giants. Google, Meta, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft. All those companies you use every day. They operate in Europe, but most of their money flows back to the United States through something called license fees. Basically, their European subsidiaries pay the parent company in America for the right to use their technology, their brand, their intellectual property. Billions of dollars every year. The ACI lets Europe mess with that. Specifically, it allows the EU to suspend the protection of US intellectual property rights. That sounds boring, but here's what it actually means. If the EU stops protecting those IP rights, then those European subsidiaries don't have to pay license fees anymore. The money that was flowing to America, it stays in Europe, and better yet, it becomes taxable in Europe. You see where this is going? Suddenly, billions of dollars that were leaving Europe and going to Silicon Valley are now stuck in Europe, and the European Union can tax them. This isn't symbolic. This is a direct hit to some of the biggest companies on the planet. This is revenue getting ripped out of American corporate balance sheets and dumped into European tax coffers. But it doesn't stop there. The ACI also allows financial restrictions on US banks. That means American banks could get blocked from participating in EU public procurement. No bidding on government contracts. No access to lucrative European public projects. If you're a big bank that does business across the Atlantic, that's a massive problem. Public procurement in Europe is worth hundreds of billions of euros. Getting locked out of that market is a nightmare. And then there's the broader stuff. The ACI gives the European Commission the authority to impose wide-ranging tariffs and quotas on any US goods and services. Not just tech, not just banks, anything. Cars, machinery, software, food, you name it. If it's American and it's being sold in Europe, it can get hit. This is cross-sector retaliation. This isn't you tariffed our steel, so we'll tariff your aluminum. This is you threatened our sovereignty, so we're going after everything. It's surgical and it's brutal. And here's the scariest part. This isn't theoretical anymore. This is live. Europe has activated this thing. They've opened the toolbox. And once you start using these tools, it's really hard to put them back. The EU isn't just threatening market access, they're weaponizing it. They're turning the European market, one of the biggest in the world, into a weapon itself. If you want to do business here, you play by our rules, and if you try to coerce us, we'll make it so expensive you'll wish you hadn't. This is economic warfare. Between allies. Part 4. The domino effect nobody can contain. So what happened after Europe pressed the button? Chaos. Organized diplomatic chaos, but chaos nonetheless. On January 18th, 2026, the same day French President Emmanuel Macron called for activating the ACI, emergency meetings started happening in Brussels. EU national ambassadors, top diplomats, the people who actually run the machinery of European policy, they all gathered for crisis talks. Not scheduled meetings, not routine consultations, crisis talks on a Sunday evening. That tells you how serious this is. The agenda: coordinate the activation of the anti-coercion instrument and discuss reviving something that's been sitting dormant for a while. 93 billion euros in suspended counter-tariffs. Let me explain that part. A while back, Europe and the US had a trade dispute. Europe prepared a massive package of counter-tariffs on American cars, food and industrial goods. 93 billion euros worth. But they suspended them. They put them on ice because both sides agreed to cool things down and negotiate. It was a sign of good faith. A signal that cooler heads were prevailing. Now Europe is talking about bringing them back. That's not just retaliation. That's a signal that the old rules are dead, that the restraint that kept things from spiraling out of control is gone. If those tariffs come back, you're looking at massive hits to American car manufacturers, agricultural exporters, and industrial producers. We're talking about sectors that employ millions of people, markets that depend on transatlantic trade. And it gets worse. Remember that EU-US trade deal that got ratified just last summer? The one that was supposed to deepen economic ties and make trade easier between the two biggest economies in the world? The European Parliament is now poised to halt its implementation. Lawmakers are saying business as usual is impossible under current threats. Think about that. A deal that took years to negotiate that was supposed to represent the future of transatlantic cooperation is getting torched because trust has evaporated. Because you can't have a trade partnership with someone who's actively threatening you. And here's the thing about retaliation. It never stays contained. The US hits Europe with tariffs. Europe activates the ACI and revives counter-tariffs. The US responds with more tariffs. Europe escalates further. Round and round it goes. Every action triggers a reaction. Every reaction triggers another action. And before you know it, you're in a full-blown trade war where both sides are bleeding and neither side can afford to back down, because backing down looks like losing. This is the domino effect. This is what happens when allies start acting like adversaries. The economic relationship between the US and Europe is worth trillions of dollars. It supports millions of jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. It's the backbone of the Western economic order, and right now, it's being used as a weapon. Nobody wins a trade war. Everybody just loses differently. Part 5. When allies start acting like adversaries. Let's zoom out for a second. Because this isn't just about trade. This is about something much bigger. On January 18th, the 8 countries targeted by Trump's tariffs issued a joint statement. They said they would stand united and that no intimidation or threat would influence their stance on Greenland's sovereignty. That unity matters. A lot. Because the anti-coercion instrument only works if Europe is actually unified. If countries start breaking ranks, if some decide to cut side deals with the US to escape the tariffs, the whole thing falls apart. The weapon loses its power, the message gets muddled, and Europe looks weak. So far, unity is holding, but unity under pressure is fragile, and the pressure is about to get a lot worse. Enter Kaja Kallas, the EU's foreign policy chief. She didn't mince words. She called this dispute an existential crisis for NATO. Existential, as in this could break the alliance. And she's right. Because NATO isn't just about tanks and troops. It's about trust. It's about the idea that these countries have each other's backs, that if one gets attacked, the others will respond, that they're stronger together than apart. But what happens when one member is economically threatening the others? What happens when trade becomes a weapon inside the alliance? How do you maintain collective defense when you're also engaged in economic warfare? You can't, not really. Callas also warned that China and Russia must be having a field day. And again, she's right. Because this is exactly what they want. They want NATO divided. They want the US and Europe at each other's throats. They want the Western alliance to fracture so badly that it can't respond to anything they do. And right now, that's exactly what's happening. Think about it from their perspective. The US and Europe are supposed to be the cornerstone of global stability. The democratic alliance that stands against authoritarianism. The economic and military powerhouse that sets the rules of the international order. But instead of focusing on actual threats, instead of coordinating on China's rise or Russia's aggression or Arctic security, they're fighting each other over Greenland. They're imposing tariffs and counter-tariffs. They're threatening each other's economies. They're acting like rivals, not allies. Arctic security, the thing that was supposed to be the whole point of the Arctic endurance exercise, has become secondary to alliance infighting. The troops are still there, the exercise is still happening, but nobody's talking about it anymore. They're too busy dealing with the economic fallout. And here's the scary part. Once trust is broken, it's really hard to get it back. Even if this dispute gets resolved, even if someone backs down or a deal gets made, the damage is done. The precedent is set. The idea that NATO allies can economically coerce each other is now on the table, and once it's on the table, it's always an option. The cost of coercion extends way beyond trade. It erodes the foundation of the entire alliance system. And once that foundation cracks, everything built on top of it becomes unstable. Part 6. The human cost of economic weapons. Alright, let's bring this down to earth for a second, because all this talk about tariffs and instruments and geopolitical strategy can make you forget one very important thing. Real people are going to pay for this. When governments fight trade wars, workers suffer. Not politicians, not diplomats, not the people making the decisions, the factory workers who lose their jobs when exports collapse. The farmers who can't sell their products anymore. The small business owners who depend on cross-border trade and suddenly can't afford to operate. Tariffs and counter-tariffs don't hurt governments. They hurt the people those governments are supposed to protect. Let's say you work in a German car factory that exports to the US. If 25% tariffs hit, American buyers can't afford your cars anymore. Orders dry up, production slows down, layoffs start. Your job, your livelihood, your ability to support your family, all of it depends on trade relationships staying stable. And now they're not. Or maybe you work in European manufacturing that depends on American technology or materials. If the ACI blocks access or raises costs, your supply chain breaks. Projects get delayed, contracts get cancelled, uncertainty spreads. And uncertainty kills investment, which kills growth, which kills jobs. And it's not just manufacturing. Public procurement delays because US firms get blocked. That means infrastructure projects slow down. Schools, hospitals, roads, all the stuff governments build for their citizens, all of it gets caught in the crossfire. Financial instability is another huge risk. When banks get restricted, when tech companies lose revenue streams, when markets start panicking because nobody knows what's coming next, capital starts fleeing, investors pull out, credit tightens. And when credit tightens, businesses can't borrow, which means they can't grow, which means they start cutting costs, which means layoffs. Then there's the tech and digital services ecosystem. If IP protections get suspended, if license fees stop flowing, what happens to the workers in those companies? What happens to the engineers, the designers, the support staff? Do they lose their jobs because revenue is down? Do they get relocated? Do they just live in constant fear that the next round of escalation will target their sector? Economic disruption creates social pressure. When people lose jobs, when prices go up, when life gets harder, they get angry. And that anger gets directed at governments. Politicians feel the heat. Public opinion shifts. And suddenly, domestic politics starts driving foreign policy decisions, which makes everything more unpredictable and more dangerous. And let's not forget the people caught in the middle of all this. The 56,000 people who live in Greenland. They didn't ask for this. They didn't ask to become a bargaining chip in a superpower struggle. They're just trying to live their lives, and now they're watching two of the most powerful entities on the planet fight over their home like it's a piece of property up for sale. The weapons that were designed to protect stability are now risking destabilizing everything. The anti-coercion instrument was supposed to defend sovereignty and prevent bullying, But when you use it, when you actually pull the trigger, the consequences ripple outward in ways nobody can fully predict or control. And here's the final reminder, the thing that makes this moment so historic and so terrifying. This weapon had never been used. Until now. For 3 years, it sat there. A deterrent, a threat, a last resort. And now it's live. Now we're in uncharted territory. Now we get to see what happens when allies stop trusting each other enough to keep the big guns holstered. Nobody knows how this ends, but we're all about to find out.